so. I'm just getting my day started off. I get here at 4 in the morning most days. And the first thing I did was fire off the pastry that's going to be packaged and delivered today. And now I'm moving on to bread as I trap myself in this labyrinth. So I have to refer to what's called a par sheet. And so this lets me know everything that's been ordered. And so I can bake to order to ensure that everything is nice and fresh. This is our last week before we go on our 2-week summer break. And before the pandemic, we used to have all of these varieties of sourdough that we would do every week, and we scaled back on that once the pandemic hit so that we could focus on making a little bit of more of all of the what are considered more essential items. Just the plain sourdough, our sandwich loaves, English muffins, and 2 different kinds of pastry, but we've been gradually bringing back some of the specials week to week, and we thought it would be a really nice kind of send-off before our summer break to bring back everybody's favorites. My favorites included, I'm a big fan of our fruit and nut bread. I'm excited to have some of those to throw in my freezer for the break. Makes really good French toast. And it's our standard fruit and nut recipe. We'll change up the kind of fruit and nut in here occasionally, but our standard is this cranberry and walnut. So I'm just pulling what I need to bake of the specials out of the fridge and bringing it over to the bake room, so I just have everything ready to go on hand. Making sure I have all of my counts right. Since we're shifting over to this daily at-home delivery, we're getting a lot more precise in the amounts that we bake off, opposed to how we did it before, where it was the Wednesday market and the Saturday market. So we're still kind of adjusting, but it gets a little more precise week to week. So I'm just gonna double check to make sure I have everything I need. 4 baguettes, 14 of each special, 6, 6, and 2, 6, 6, and 2. All right, looks good. So we bake our bread straight from the fridge. The colder it is, the easier it is to control the fermentation process and prevent it from overproofing. And so it's especially important over the summer to keep the bread cold for as long as possible. We have these tarps lined up. I could probably take this down because it's blocking out the heat that comes in from the oven room into the mixing room while the guys are mixing the pastry dough and the sourdough. And a lot of the heat in the bakery comes from the oven room. So we keep those tarps up to kind of block some of the heat going in, and it works fairly well. All of our bread that gets baked in this oven gets baked at the same temperature, aside from the baguettes. It gets a little bit hotter in there, and that's what helps it give the baguettes the signature crust. So what I'm doing here is I'm pulling out these boards. This is what I'll transfer the bread onto when I score it, and then it's what helps me transfer the bread into the oven. Since we bake directly on the stone, I put a nice layer of bran down first, bran being a byproduct that's sifted out of the flour when it's milled, and it just helps keep a nice protective layer on the bottom of the bread to prevent it from burning. And so you might notice that the bottom of our bread is a different color just from the brand. All right, so I'm gonna start off with the baguettes here. Amanda is definitely the master of baguettes in here, but I think I do a pretty okay job. So I'm just placing these down, typically do 4 to a board, and I have exactly 4, so that's perfect. When you're laying, or at least when I'm spacing these out on the board, I'm gonna try to keep it exactly this way when I transfer it into the oven, and that's the tricky part, especially with baguettes. Amanda has a lot more finesse than I do in that regard. If you don't transfer them straight and have them be the same exact shape that they are on the board, then they're suspect to curve and distort in shape. These couches from the baguettes get a little wet, so I just hang them up to dry them out before we use them again. You don't want them to get moldy. All right, so next I top them off with rice flour. This is purely for aesthetics. So what the rice flour does is that it keeps the surface of the bread that we're baking nice and white, and it gives it a nice contrast between the bread and the scoring, and it really makes it pop. And that's especially important when I get into decorative scoring, but I'll get into that later. Scoring baguettes is really the only place where any of us feel like a traditional lahm works better than the other kind of lahm we use. It's really designed to cut right underneath the lip, or right underneath the skin of the baguette, to create that really nice open ear. As Amanda's covered before, when you're scoring baguettes, you're really working in the middle third, and you don't want to stray outside of that. And so what I'm going to do in the middle third, kind of from left to right, is do 3 lines. You can do 4 if you're feeling fancy. Today I'm not really feeling that bold. So as you're scoring, you want the blade to almost be horizontal, and to just be laying flat on top of the skin. And so what you're aiming to do is just cutting directly underneath the skin. You're not cutting down, you're cutting from the side. And so if you've seen there, like I really have a narrow range between each score. There's only a little bit in between, and ideally that little island will stay intact as it bakes. And as I'm scoring these lines, there's only about an inch of overlap. We used to make baguettes every week, and I think I was more confident in my baguette scoring then, but it's been a little while, so I'm feeling a little rusty. All right, first thing I always do is check to make sure there's no bran residue left over. All right, so this is the tricky part I was talking about. So as I'm kind of shoving the board, I'm trying to make them transfer in flat. And all right, here we go. Hey, not too bad. Any kind of hesitation in your movement when you're transferring the baguettes can cause chaos. So you really just have to be smooth and confident in your movement, even if you're not necessarily feeling smooth and confident. So we're doing 15 minutes with steam for the first round. So each variety of our bread gets scored in a different way. Just so no matter if we change the type of mix-ins inside, like with the fruit and nut, if we change the type of fruit and nut, you can always tell what it is just by looking at the scoring. So for example, the olive loaves get a nice little X scoring on top, which is nice and simple. It's a very classic type of functional scoring. And what I mean by functional scoring is, well, I guess I should start with what scoring is to begin with. So scoring is just the cuts that you make into a loaf of bread. And there's two different kinds of scoring. I can't say that these are official terms for what they're called. If they're not, just pretend that they are for the sake of this conversation. So the first type is functional scoring. So functional scoring are the deeper cuts that are made into a loaf of bread that helps the bread bake into the ideal shape that you want. When left to its own devices, if you were to just throw a loaf of unscored bread in the oven, as it bakes and expands and steam is being released from inside the loaf, it'll find the weakest point in the loaf to break open. And so you can control where it breaks by making the cuts yourself. And also, if you don't score the bread, there's a big chance that the skin of the bread won't break open at all, and it'll just bake in a really condensed and constricted shape, and it'll end up being smaller in size, even if it's the same amount of dough than it would have if you scored it. So I'm just dusting this rice flour here. I distribute it with my hand. And now we're back to my favorite lahm. So among sourdough bakers, this is universally agreed to be the gold standard of lahms. It's made by a shop called Wire Monkey Shop. And the appeal of this kind of lahm is that it gives you a lot of control. When you compare it to the traditional lahm, your hand is kind of so far removed from where the blade is that you lose a lot of control, which is, if you're just opting for functional scoring, it's not a big deal, but as you get into decorative scoring, it's the closest that you can get to just holding a razor in your hand, which, for maybe obvious reasons, is not advised. It's the closest you can get to essentially drawing with a razor. So what I'm doing here is the X scoring that I mentioned earlier, and it's the same thing with the baguette scoring with the angle of the blade. I'm not cutting straight down. And what scoring in this way does is it creates these little mini ears. And so the shape that I'm going for with this scoring is to have these kind of rise up into these little triangular cat ears. And this is just a really classic and basic form of functional scoring. All right. Gotta set the oven, make sure the vent's closed. Those are good to go. On to the next one. So I'm just redistributing the bran that was left on the board from the last round so that I don't have to continually add, or I can just add to the places that are a little sparse. Just a little light dusting. Although admittedly, I think I use more bran than anyone else in the bakery. I had a couple weeks where I was having issues with the bottom of the loaves being burnt, and I haven't quite recovered from that fear. I've always thought the fruit and nut loaves are really pretty. We soak the cranberries before mixing them in with the dough, and so once they're mixed in, the juices leak out and it creates this really pretty marbling inside of each loaf, which is a really nice effect. So it's always a surprise to cut them open and see what each loaf is like. So the scoring pattern for this one, again working in the middle third and working at this horizontal angle, I do 2 long slashes with a little bit of overlap, and then just a little wheat stalk here, and then a little wheat stalk here. And so no matter what's in the fruit and nut, people selling at the market and our regular customers who are familiar with how each loaf of bread looks can just easily identify it by the scoring pattern. Most sourdough bakers at home will score on top of a rotating cake stand, which is really useful, but not really practical for the volume I'm doing here. Rotating these boards can be a little clunky, but it would take a lot more time to transfer each individual loaf. Also, I try to score these kinds of loaves last, just because the mix-ins in the loaf degrade the blade down and make it dull faster. But I always recommend using a fresh blade. A lot of people ask me if getting a fancy lom is necessary. And, you know, depending on what you're doing, it's really not. If you're not trying to do intricate decorative scoring, you really don't need something like this. But if you're trying to make artistic designs, it makes it a lot easier. I probably go through an average of 4 razors a day, depending on what I'm doing. All right, these are ready to go in. This deck could probably use a little bit of an extra sweep. Any bran left in the oven will burn. And then if you're just to put bread on top of the burnt bran, then it kind of negates the whole purpose of putting bran down on the boards to begin with. And they go. I'm always paranoid that I've left a loaf in a banneton and that it'll get forgotten. It's only happened once, but once was enough. All right, now we're moving on to sourdough. Today's Tuesday, which is pretty light as far as production days go. On any given day, I'm scoring and baking 1 to 5 speed racks of sourdough, in addition to any possible English muffins, sandwich loaves, and all the pastry. So since it's summer, I've been coming in earlier. Before I was coming in anywhere from 6 to 9 a.m. But now that it's summer in Arizona and it gets pretty hot fairly quickly, I come in at 4 to get things going. Ideally, to try to beat the heat. It gets really hot in here, which is uncomfortable, but also it causes the bread to proof faster than is ideal, as it's just sitting out on the rack waiting to be baked. So the first round with the baguettes is done. Everything looks good. I'm opening up the steam vent. Once the steam is released, that's when you really get the nice color, and then the crust starts to harden. My role here at Proof, while I do a little bit of everything, is to bake and score the bread. I don't think it's my official job title, but John has referred to me before as the bread artist here. And so the special role that I fulfill is making each loaf unique with my scoring. And so really the purpose of doing that is not just to make a pretty loaf, but it's supposed to be a visual representation of all the work that everyone else does before it reaches me. You know, it's really important that people see and know that this whole process is done by people and by hand. Most sourdough bakeries, if they do anything, any kind of decorative scoring at all, it's really basic. When I first started here, I spent some time with Amanda on the table where she showed me the ropes, and then they really just gave me free rein to score as I wish. When I'm teaching other people in the bakery how to score, I have them focus on really learning and mastering and getting comfortable with the wheat stock pattern. It's a really basic and classic pattern, and once you get really comfortable with that, you're probably at a point where you're really in tune with how your bread should feel, how it should look, how using the lawn should feel in your hand. And there's really an infinite number of patterns that you can utilize just from learning the wheat stock. So I'm just going to do a few examples of a basic wheat stock here. So it's all about the angle in a wheat stock. Something that I've noticed in myself and other people I've been teaching in the bakery is that the angle that they're using for the wheat stock isn't quite sharp enough. I would say that you want to be scoring at like a 5-degree angle. When I first started doing it, certainly I was kind of doing it at too wide of an angle, which is, you know, do whatever you want. Everybody here, certainly, and every sourdough baker I know has their own unique style and flair that I really enjoy. So I'll just start by, and this is where you, for decorative scoring, is where you really want to cut straight down. So I'm just doing, like if you imagine a straight line here, I'm just scoring along that straight line, and then I repeat the same thing on the other side, leaving a little bit of a gap, and then I finish it off with one line pointing straight up. And if you'll notice as I'm cutting, you should see the scoring start to open up almost immediately. If your scoring isn't opening up immediately, it might be due to there not being adequate tension that's built up in the loaf from folding and shaping. And then what I'm doing here is an example of a functional score that I mentioned earlier, and this is what is going to bring out the loaf. It's going to bake and expand into the desired shape that I'm going for, and hopefully it'll give me a nice ear. So once you really get used to and comfortable with scoring a wheat stock, it becomes second nature. You know, I don't even really have to think about it. And one thing that I like to do on the bake table is I like to think about how many variations I can come up of the same design. And so for the wheat stock, how many different ways can I score a single wheat stock? Well, I can change it up by scoring it a little lighter. And so I'm cutting fairly deep here. I tend to like just kind of a bold wheat stock by default. But here I can start to score it. And so here I'm not cutting nearly as deep. And this is going to be a little bit more of an elegant and delicate look. You'll see with the ear here, I'm scoring this at about, what would you say that is? Like a 30-degree angle. And it's not a straight line down. It starts and ends at the middle point, but it just curves out very slightly. And you want to do this at about the 3/4 mark of the loaf. Some other ways you can mix up the wheat stock. I can do like a long and deeper score, and then a kind of lighter and shorter one, and alternate. And there's no reason why you would need to neglect this side of the loaf. You can add a little bit of flair there. Let me check on these baguettes. So the scoring has opened up pretty nicely. You can see these lips and ridges that open up. The little islands in between have maintained in their shape, but they're a little light in color. So I'm gonna let them hang out in here for a little longer. 3 minutes seems to be the magic number. So when I was first starting out, you know, I spent a lot of time with Amanda on the table. Well, I spent a couple weeks, and then I was kind of just let loose. She taught me a lot of the basics, but there's just a lot that you can't really learn before you're doing it yourself. A lot of it has to do with knowing your bread, knowing the way it's supposed to feel, and just learning the muscle memory that comes with really any kind of skill. And while there's a lot of resources out there on how to make sourdough, there's really not anything when it comes to scoring outside of how to do really basic functional scoring, like doing the X score, getting an ear, and then maybe just a really basic wheat stock. But if you're interested in making decorative designs on your loaf, you're really just kind of on your own. There are a lot of sourdough bakers on Instagram that do really beautiful decorative scoring. If you're interested in kind of keeping up with those bakers and the unique designs that they do, you can look up the hashtag bread scoring on Instagram. And a lot of them will make time lapses of them scoring their loaves, which has been really helpful. But in a time lapse where there's no audio overlay, they're not really telling you what they're doing, why they're doing it. And so while it's helpful to have one level of just seeing how it's done, I've had to spend a lot of time just experimenting to figure out what works and what doesn't, and having to do a lot of troubleshooting as to why something I was trying to do didn't turn out. And in my experience, sourdough bakers online are incredibly friendly and helpful. And if you ask them questions, you know, I've never personally had an experience where someone was trying to hold their secrets close to their chest and wasn't willing to help other people. But you really have to do the work to seek out that information yourself. I think the baguettes are good. Probably could have done a little bit of a neater job here. The lines are a bit cleaner here. They're a little bit jagged here. The bread can smell your fear. If you aren't sure of yourself and your pressure and your movement, the bread will call you out. It'll snag, it'll ripple. Which, you know, maybe that's something that most people aren't even gonna notice. But I notice, and that's what matters. So I was mentioning earlier, there's two different kinds of scoring. Functional scoring and decorative scoring. And the functional scoring is what shapes the loaf into the desired shape as it bakes, and then the decorative scoring is, you know, just the pretty stuff. And that's really what my specialty is here as a bread artist, is to make the bread pretty. People only see the way that the outside of the bread looks as they're passing by our market, as they're looking online. Most sourdough bakeries don't bother to do any kind of decorative scoring. It takes too much time. It takes a certain level of skill. It just isn't really seen as being worth the time. And so it's nice to have the creative freedom and liberty that I get in this role to score whatever suits my fancy. I'm always trying to come up with new designs. I'd like to think that regular customers of ours, whenever they open a pre-order that they got from the market or get a home delivery, I hope that they get something different each time. So this is where the use of rice flour really comes into play. It's going to help differentiate between the parts of the bread that are scored and the parts that aren't, because the surface of the loaf should stay nice and white while the scoring will open up, deepen in color, give a nice contrast. So essentially with decorative scoring, all I'm doing is drawing on bread with a razor. And I scored enough to kind of experiment and see what works and what doesn't. But it's also really kind of difficult to keep track of. I'm constantly scoring and putting loaves in the oven, and so I might not necessarily remember what I did with one particular design to make it work or make it not work. I'm really inspired by, you know, the things around me. I'm new to Arizona. The desert is really still kind of a novelty to me. I like to score cacti, desert scenes, fruit and vegetables that are in season. I like to keep things joyful and whimsical. Every time I open the oven, I've really got to look at what's in there and assess how I should change any kind of settings and baking times. Each deck acts in a different way. There's different hot spots in each one. Changes in the temperature, atmospheric pressure, humidity, everything affects the way that the bread bakes. And so, especially for the first round of the day, I've really got to keep in tune with how the oven is behaving so I can make sure to make any alterations for the rest of the bake. All right, so some things to keep in mind when you're scoring. There is a finite amount of tension that's built in the loaf. And so that's what's coming into play when you're scoring and the lines start to open up. It's reacting to the tension that's built and spreading open. If you're to make too many cuts into the bread, that's going to affect any kind of functional scoring that you do, like the ear. If I score too closely, too deeply to the ear, the tension that's here is going to be competing between the decorative scoring and the ear, and so you might lose some height that you get with the ear opening up because of how you implemented any decorative scoring. Another thing, which I noticed exactly when I did it, is you also don't really want to be scoring too deeply on kind of the bottom edge of the bread. That's another place where typically when this happens, this scoring is going to be competing with this score here, and what's likely going to happen here is that this is going to split open in a way that I don't want. Another thing that I recommend to people who are learning how to score, once you learn how to do the basic wheat stock and you really get comfortable with it, continue on that trend of figuring out a design and sticking with it until you're comfortable. One thing that I definitely did a lot when I was first starting out is that I would score something, it wouldn't turn out the way I wanted, I would get frustrated, and then I'd move on to something else, and it would just be kind of a vicious cycle. Even though I have stood in this spot for many days and many hours, I still sometimes find myself looking at a blank loaf of bread and being like, wow, I've never scored before in my life. I have no idea what to do. And so a lot of times I'll ask for suggestions from other people in the bakery to kind of just give me some inspiration. I tend to score a design until it's something I'm comfortable with, and then I do it a lot and I get kind of stuck in a little bit of a creative rut. All right, we've got our olive loaves here, and these ears are coming out exactly the way that I wanted to. The X shape is really nice for keeping a nice round loaf in the shape that you want while still having a really aesthetically pleasing look to it. These could use a bit more color. These olive loaves don't really ever get as hard of a crust as the other ones just because the hydration level is higher from the olives being mixed in. Strawberries are in season, so I've been doing a lot of strawberries. When radishes were first coming into season, I did a lot of those. When I first started here, I always had this notebook handy for me to reference for the specific scoring that would be on like the fruit and nut loaf, the multigrain loaf, and then any ideas I might come up with for scoring patterns that I wanted to experiment with on the sourdough. And like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of amazing and very skilled sourdough bread artists on Instagram. I'm always keeping up with what they're doing, and a lot of us feed off of each other's styles and creativity. Getting used to the oven was a bit overwhelming at first. There's always some kind of timer going off. Getting into the routine of when the vent is open and when it's closed. But I've come to know the oven really well, and we have a very interesting relationship, for better or worse. Being in the bake room all day in the heat does weird things to you sometimes. All right, these are ready to come out. So these nice little lips that you get here are a result of scoring in line with the top of the loaf instead of cutting straight down. That's how you get these little lips, these little mini ears. Gotta reset the oven, set the timer, close the vent, and then possibly the most important part of scoring is saying a little prayer to the bread gods as it goes in for the bake. Ask that they be kind and merciful. Maybe give your bread a little bit of a pep talk. Pre-pandemic, I used to work at one of the Saturday markets, and it's something that I really miss. I really got to know the customers at my particular market. Once they knew me as the person who scored the bread, I would get special requests. They would ask me a lot of questions. You know, maybe they might have a sourdough baker in their family. This is where I spend probably 99% of my time. And I mean, we bake bread to feed people. And, you know, who isn't excited when you have bread? Just the reactions that I would get from people and the joy of being handed a beautiful loaf of bread, something that would keep me inspired. And so I've largely shifted to being part of the sourdough community on Instagram. But a lot of my old market regulars follow me on there, and I get a little bit of the same interaction that I did before. And most people don't have the same luxury that I do to have so many loaves of bread at their disposal, which might make the fact that there's so little information out there about sourdough scoring pretty frustrating, because, you know, someone's putting in all the time to mix, fold, shape, and retard a single loaf, and then to experiment, you know, they gotta wait until next week to score another loaf and see what works. So I'm really in a unique position to really play with this as much as I like, to see what works and what doesn't. And one thing that you might notice that I'm doing is I kind of pull the skin of the loaf taut here to create some more tension, to make it a little smoother when I cut into for the ear. Another thing to keep in mind with scoring is that you don't want to overscore. Because of the different scoring competing with the tension, it might not come out in the way that you want it to. And if there's too much scoring competing for the same amount of tension, it won't necessarily open up in the way that you want it to. So I've dulled this razor, and so I'm just going to switch it to the other side. I just had to loosen it up part way, and now the part that was hidden underneath these two little discs is now exposed and is fresh. So if you're finding that your loaf is snagging a lot on your razor as you're scoring, that could be coming from a few different things. It could be coming from your loaf being too warm, overproofed. There might not be enough tension in the loaf. Or you might just have a dull razor. It's really about being really familiar with your bread and figuring out a baseline of what it's supposed to feel like. So another thing that you can do to decorate your loaves, you know, maybe you're not confident in your scoring abilities, or, you know, whatever reason, you can use stencils. And these are ones that I've designed myself. I've been working on these. I've got some that are just for proof. I was experimenting with what size worked the best for the size of our loaves. Our loaves are about 800 grams, and I found that this largest one doesn't really work all that great. I'm always experimenting with stuff like that. And I started making stencils based off of my scoring patterns. John and Amanda bought me a set of stencils that were advertised for using on sourdough bread, but I found that the way that they're designed is really not made for bread, which is why I started making my own. So this is an example of some of the stuff that came in this pack that was made for stenciling on bread. And as you can see, it's this big clunky square. And so this outside space is really necessary for when you're stenciling, on a wall, on a flat surface. It's what, keeps the paint where you want it and prevents any paint on this area, what's referred to as overspray, from getting where you don't want it. But they're really meant to be used on flat surfaces, and these loaves are curved. And so it's really difficult to apply the stencil in the way that you want to, especially if you're trying to add your design on the side of the loaf and still maintain a nice classic ear. So this is a little bit of what I mean by that. This little garden gnome guy is one of my scoring patterns that I've come up with, and I've designed a stencil in a way to where if you want, you can just place it down and you can cover the whole loaf with flour and not have to worry about this big awkward negative space, this big square that's just going to be there, and it's really just not appealing. And then you have to worry about these little tabs. As you might notice, this just sits really well on top of the loaf, whereas these just aren't really made to conform to any kind of curved surface. And so to apply the stencil, I'll get the loaf wet. You don't want to get it too wet. If you get it too wet, the flour will get cakey on top and it'll crack and get a little discolored. And then you can just place the stencil on top. And it should generally stick to the loaf when it's wet. Then I'm going to take my rice flour. You have to have a really gentle hand when you're applying flour to a stencil. You don't want to overload it with flour. Like that. It's not ideal, but we can work with it. All right. These guys are ready to come out. And so you can see an example of kind of my style of wheat stock here. I really like those bold lines. That's generally my go-to. This end result tells me a lot about what happened at every stage up until this process of me scoring and baking it. I can talk to whoever was on mixing and shaping about what might possibly need to be changed based on what I see from the end result. For instance, if I'm just not able to get an ear as I'm baking, that could be due to a shaping issue, that could be due to the fridge is not being cold enough, it could be due to the bread not getting put in the fridge soon enough. So when you're distributing the flour for stencils, the general rule is you want to push from the inside out. If you have any parts like this that are generally sticking up, push the flour in a way that pushes it down. You don't want to be pushing this way, because then it'll push the flour underneath where you don't want the stencil. And then just carefully peel it up. There you have it. Happy little garden gnome. The garden gnome was a special request from a regular, and I scored him once, and I was just so delighted with it that I kept going, and then ended up being one of the first stencils I made. And speaking of basing new designs off of old designs, it's not that far off from my Santa. You know, you change the proportions a little bit. The hat is pointy, doesn't have the little ball at the end. And especially when you pair it with, pair the gnome with flowers, gives, you know, something that's essentially the same design a whole different use. And so another one of my favorite scoring designs that I came up with is this little mushroom guy. I guess part of my garden decoration series. You want to make sure that you don't have an excessive buildup of flour in the negative space of the stencil, or even just sitting on top of the stencil, because as you peel it off, the excess will fall into the parts of the design where you're trying to prevent it from going. So I definitely recommend bread stencils if you're intimidated by scoring, or if you just want to mix it up. Especially since, you know, these are my designs. They're things I can do easily, but it's a little less time consuming. That's a pretty satisfying ear there. It's a little small, but it's got the right lift in the lip underneath. And the gradient here on the exposed dough is always very satisfying. So you might notice that this part isn't really sticking, and that's okay. You can kind of just hold any parts that stick up down as you apply the flour. You just got to pay attention to which direction you're smoothing the flour. One thing that never gets old, no matter how much bread I bake, is opening the door and seeing just like a line of really pretty ears. It's really interesting to me. I've been interested in bread making for a long time, and I've been just generally into making art for a really long time. But it wasn't until I started working here that I really thought of bread as something that could be an art medium. As you can see here as I'm doing this score, you can kind of see where it's snagging here. I can definitely feel that this dough isn't as firm. It's a little loose. As you're feeling the top of your dough, you should get really familiar with the way that it should feel. Like, I can tell just by the way that it looks before I even touch it that the shape of the loaf is really expanded more than what's desired. That could be from the bread not being shaped tightly enough. It can be any number of things. Part of my role here is always kind of adapting to each loaf in the condition that it's in when it gets to me, and still trying to make the prettiest loaf possible with what's given. And by no means is it not going to be edible. Is it not going to be delicious? Is it not still going to be a perfectly fine and acceptable and good looking loaf? But I'm always paying attention to those details and figuring out what we can do to improve to have consistent results. I'm careful to make sure that I distribute the flour evenly in the negative space, especially in lettering, where it's more important that, you know, it's legible, whereas if some finer details are missed in an image, it's not as big of a deal. And then you would just want to make sure that there's no excess flour sitting on top of this stencil as you peel it off. It's pretty easy. And I like to mix and match too. Got a little bit of a wheat stalk there. And I'm noticing as it's snagging, I'm going through a checklist in my head of what all the possible things may be. I just switched to a fresh side of the razor, so it's not that my razor is dull. And I'm also noticing in my decorative scoring that it's not snagging. So it's definitely an issue with either temperature, tension, something like that. And I've got a cool one here with a proof peel. And with this one, I'll demonstrate kind of a non-traditional style of functional scoring. Man, I just dumped a mountain of flour on there. Not ideal, but we should still be able to make it work. Oh boy. It's all about adapting as you go. You know, I do this all day, 4 or 5 days a week. But, you know, I'm not perfect at it either. And I think that's something that people need to keep in mind. You know, I get a lot of remarks on Instagram that people wish their scoring could turn out like mine, but not all of my scoring looks like what I post on Instagram. There are hundreds of loaves that you don't see. So this scoring I'm doing here is one that I use primarily on my big decorative loaves that are called centerpieces. And those are, so for comparison, these are 800 gram loaves and the centerpieces are 2,000 gram loaves. And those are traditionally just like marketed as kind of like a dinner party loaf, a gift for special events. And I just kind of go all out in my decorative scoring on those. And to maintain the decorative scoring without using an ear or without using an X scoring is you can implement something like this. Again, I don't know if this is a real name for it, but I call it framing. So I have this like oval framing here to kind of showcase the decoration on top. And ideally what this will do is it'll allow the loaf to maintain the shape that I want. And you know, the scoring will actually work like an actual frame, like artwork in a frame. This part will lift up and be framed by this exposed dough that'll turn darker. And it's just a really nice visual contrast. And that's something that I've been playing around with and experimenting with as I've been going. And since Tuesdays are one of the lighter production day, it's one of the days that I really, you know, if I have a lot of new ideas, a lot of new things I want to experiment with, I have a lot more time, since it is a lighter production day, to spend more time with each loaf. And so I try to get my experimentation out at the beginning of the week so that by the time I'm on the weekend, I've got whatever I want worked out. So here is really the only time in the process where you get to assess what works and what doesn't. The scoring for the main outline of the cactus and then, you know, the little striations that go through there is a bit thicker and wider than I would like. But overall, it's successful. It doesn't really look like the scoring was competing too much with the decorative scoring. The image of what it's supposed to be, you know, looks pretty clear to me. I hope that what it's supposed to be comes across to other people. And then I've got my Sourdough cactus here. I like the striations, the detail lines on the inside. That design in particular, for whatever reason, took a long time for me to figure out while maintaining the ear that I wanted. So maybe someone can help me out as to why this happens. I've done some experimenting to try to replicate this on purpose, and I still can't ever really figure out why the ear splits open in two ways. But, you know, overall it's successful. It still generally maintains the shape that I want. The decorative scoring came out really nicely. And something that I try to remind myself, because before I was making art on bread, you know, I was making all other kinds of visual art. And see, here's one where the ear wasn't successful. And again, that could be for any number of reasons, the angle, and it was on both of these. And since these are two in a row, it's likely that it looks like this is probably my fault. I'm just assuming based off of, you know, I likely scored one after another. I had the muscle memory and the angle of my hand and the angle of the loam wrong for both of them. And so if you're off just a little bit, the results vary, you know, a fair amount. Like just looking at the difference between these two and how successful and prominent this ear here is, such a tongue twister, compared to this one. This one might also be because the scoring here is too deep and too close to the edge of the ear. And so where I was talking about how the scoring can be competing for attention. So overall, I'm pretty pleased with how these are turning out. Over time, I've gotten better at getting a more consistent ear, but it's also not all under my control. I can only work with what's given to me and just try to adapt based off of how each loaf is behaving. There's just a lot of intricacies that you can't really meaningfully teach to someone else, because the bread that we work with is, you know, so much different than the bread that you might be making at home when it comes down to the type of flour that we use, the amount of protein in the flour, how much gluten is built up when we're mixing the dough, how much tension we have, our shaping methods. All these things come into play. And so it's really about knowing your bread and how it behaves. Because the tips I might be giving to any given person might not pertain to their dough. My standards of what is acceptable is purely based on selfish reasons. You know, just kind of soft, loose bread is not ideal for scoring. You want a nice taut surface that makes a really beautiful canvas. I mean, the way that the bread is now, it's softer. I can tell by feeling it that there's not as much tension as the gases build up inside, but it's gonna still make perfectly fine and acceptable bread. I just get a little cranky about it, because then I don't necessarily get to do what I want as far as decorative scoring goes. On a busy production day, So say for a Friday, where I'm baking 5 times the amount of sourdough loaves that I am today, I don't want to spend more than like 10 to 12 seconds scoring each loaf, because the longer that any decks of the oven remain open, the longer it takes to get through all the bread. And so on Friday is really when I lean on the scoring designs that I practice the most, so I can just confidently crank them out. One thing that's been really kind of frustrating, but also nice in a way, about using bread as an art form is that, on the one hand, the thing about it that I really enjoy, but is also very frustrating, is that I don't have as much control over what art gets to be exposed to the general public and what doesn't. When I'm making art on anything else at home, if it doesn't come out the way that I want it to, I can just decide to scrap it, start over, and work on it until I come up with something I'm satisfied with. I don't really have that option there, or that option here when it comes to bread. I'm not going to throw away a loaf of bread because, it doesn't come out as pretty as I want to. So it's kind of been a nice way for me to relax a bit when it comes to my own standards of what's good and what's acceptable. And I try to remember, or at least I would imagine that most people aren't judging my scoring technique as harshly as I am. So when I'm pulling bread out of the oven, I'm always taking a second to kind of assess each loaf, what was successful, what was unsuccessful. And like I mentioned before, it's still a perfectly fine and great loaf of bread. It's gonna taste just as good, but I'm always finding ways to take note of how I can improve as an artist, as a baker. So I've decided to just shift over to the wheat stock because as I'm feeling the dough, I'm kind of feeling it losing tension as the gas builds up inside. And so I can tell based off of that any kind of decorative storing that I do outside of wheat stocks, anything that has, curves in it, is likely to snag. And the outcome is going to be less than desirable by my standards, probably my own worst critic. In they go. Good luck, guys. I believe in you.